I think I broke a
Unlike
fiddle
Uncle
player.
Bonsai, we don't have to pay for this by the inch.
Yes. They have a live recording where they mention that.
We're back, and here we go. Now, this episode is really interesting in the way Joyce wrote it. Even though it's pretty easy to follow what's happening, there is some kind of oddball language. It's a little bit choppy, and it seems to be interrupted. So I hope that this video helps you appreciate it more deeply. I'm sure you can follow what's going on. This episode is one of the easier ones to catch, action by action, what happens. But then the language makes it a little bit distracting to get the full impact. So I'm hoping that this video opens you up to some new ideas. One thought, I would encourage you to pick a page, any page. I love the last 3 pages. Read them out loud and see what they sound like. Okay, so that's a tip. Get a good sense of how this writing sounds, because Joyce is trying to achieve something here, and I'll cover that in a second. Another thing you might want to do is look up Edgar Allan Poe's poem, The Bells. Read that. Read it out loud. Poe tries to evoke the sounds of various types of bells in the poem using only words. And Joyce is doing something similar here, although more complex, where Poe is trying to evoke the sound of bells. Joyce is trying to give us the sound of a written musical piece, not just maybe a sonata. It is actually fairly close to a sonata form. So he's writing something here that he wants us to hear, and from the hearing of that musical piece that's in words, for us to experience something. So take those tips and take them to heart and use them, please. Now, as always, let's start with where are we in the Odyssey? Now, at this point, Odysseus is approaching this island where these beautiful women are, and they sing these songs, and the sailors are so enchanted by the song that they turn toward the island and crash and die on the rocks. So, in order to prevent his ship from crashing on the rocks with the siren song, which is unavoidable, you can't resist it, Odysseus has the crew put wax in their ears. So all his crew members have wax in the ears so they can't hear the sound. And then Odysseus asks the crew to tie him to the mast because he wants to hear it. He wants to know what this sounds like. But he has them tie him to the mast, and he says, whatever I tell you to do, don't do it. And if I tell you to untie me, don't do it. Don't do anything until we're well clear of this place. And so as they go past the sirens, Odysseus is tortured by the sound of the sirens. Okay, so that's a little Odyssey recap. Now, Joyce is doing something musical with the language here. At the beginning, whoop, there went my lights. Okay, so the piece starts out a little bit choppy. There's all these fragmented sentences. Now, what's that all about? Well, if you've been to a classical concert, the orchestra is warming up, and you hear little chops of the piece that's going to be played. If you go to hear Beethoven's Fifth, you might hear a bunch of noise, and then you hear one violin. They're playing it, so you can hear little fragments of the piece. And so this episode starts with the orchestra warming up. So there's these little fragments at the very beginning, which I think is kind of interesting the way he plays that for us. Then we meet the Sirens. Okay, so we have Bronze by Gold. We have the two waitresses at the bar of the Ormond Hotel. Bronze and Gold. And I think it's amusing the way Joyce does that. It give you a laugh out of it. Now, on the surface, we would feel like here are your sirens. The two waitresses, Bronze and Gold. We see the guys, particularly Simon comes in and he's sort of ogling them, and they say he's Simple Simon, and I love the way the way it reads in the episode. He is, and Simon sort of makes flirt with these two waitresses, and then the Viceroy's carriage goes by, and they go to the window to look, and they see one of the guys on the carriages looking back at the girls, and they're flattered by the attention. So on the surface, it would seem that here are the Sirens. And then Lenehan comes in and he's ogling them, and Boylan shows up and he's ogling these waitresses. So at the very obvious level, when you read this, it's like, yeah, there's the Sirens. Okay, the women, the barmaids, those are the Sirens. And we see the guys crashing in. They come in, they order drinks, and that obviously is their downfall. And they're making flirt with these waitresses, so that's the Sirens. And the guy singing, there's the siren song. But are these waitresses the Sirens? Are those the real Sirens? And I would say no. That the Sirens, what brings us to crash on the rocks, is not a couple of waitresses in the Ormond Hotel. There's something much bigger that's crashing the Dublin society. Now, throughout this episode, we hear music all around us. And again, I would encourage you to read some of it out loud. Pick any page you want and read it out loud. And you hear the ding, clang, tap, tap, tap. And that tapping, it builds such tension as we proceed near the end of the episode, that tap, tap, tap. And we feel Bloom get tenser and tenser because he's thinking about Boylan is on his way to meet with Molly, and he knows that's going to happen. And he's thinking about the carriage going there, and we hear the jingle jangle as Boylan's carriage gets closer and closer to the residence of Leopold and Molly Bloom. And we hear the tap, 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 until you want to scream of the stripling as he's on his way back to pick up the tuning fork that he left behind. So there's all these musical references, and we get the tension of the musical piece. You ever listen to a piece of music that just has this great tension in it? That's what's going on here, is the tension is building to this grand climax. Okay, so we know that the hour of 4 is approaching. And Bloom steps into the Orland. He meets Richie Goulding outside. They decide, let's eat dinner, so they're going to eat together. The first thing to notice is Bloom wants to go in the Orland because he is now following Boylan. Now, previous episodes, he sees Boylan and he panics. He gets heart palpitation and he hides. Remember at the museum outside the National Library, he sees Boylan walking down the street, tipping his hat to various people, and Bloom panics and he hides behind the statue and he, safe, remember that. Now he sees Boylan and he follows him. I'm going to have a look at this guy. Bloom is getting much stronger and bolder as we progress. He's not going to confront Boylan, but he's not as weakened by Boylan as he has been in past episodes. In fact, he makes a conscious choice. He's going to go in there. He's not making an effort to be seen because he's going to slip off to the dining room. The bar's in a separate room. But he does go in where Boylan is. He knows Boylan's there, and there's a very good chance Boylan could see him. There's a chance they could meet each other. But Bloom chooses this place because Boylan is there. That's a big difference. Notice what Bloom eats. He's not in this soft vegetarian mode anymore. He's not worried about animals at this point. He's not, going to find the least harmful thing. He's not worried about, the treatment of animals and the presentation of his meal. No, he's going right back to his inner organs of beasts and fowl, as we see at the beginning. So he's eating a much heartier, meaty, and visceral meal once again. Okay, and Bloom hears the singing, and he's nearly overcome with grief. It just hits him that, the assignation between Boylan and Molly is going to happen. He knows that's going to happen. He hears this music, and the singing, the song hits him in the gut, and he's just overwhelmed with grief. Now, what he hears is an excerpt from an opera called Martha. Coincidence, because who is Bloom doing this written correspondence affair with? A woman, Martha, right? So I don't like to just read stuff to you, but I think the best way to do this is to just read it. I want to read to you a synopsis of the opera Martha. This is kind of interesting. It's written by a guy, Flotow. Okay? Flotow. Now just think of that name and how Joyce plays with words throughout this episode. So this fellow, Flotow, wrote the opera Martha. Now let me give you a synopsis of this opera, because this episode really more closely follows this opera than it does the Odyssey, actually. So I'll read the best I can. I'm not a great reader in this respect out loud, but I'll do the best I can. So here's a synopsis of the opera Martha. So Act 1. Lady Harriet Durham, maid of honor to Queen Anne, is so tired of court life and so sick of her many admirers, she retires to the country. So we have this upper crust lady, and she goes off to live in the country. And she becomes bored with that, so she decides to attend the fair at Richmond, where girls hire themselves out as servants. Sort of a festival day. You can hire anybody. The girls go there, and you can hire them for a day as maids. For a laugh, she and her confidant, Nancy, masquerade as maidservants. And her foppish old cousin, Sir Tristan, another admirer of hers that she really isn't interested in, accompanies them. And Harriet manages to lose her escort. She ditches Tristan. And then she and Nancy stand in line with the other girls waiting to be hired. And then two young farmers show up, Lionel and Plunkett. And they're looking for a couple of wenches to do their housework. And being struck by the beauty and charm of these two upper crust girls that are masquerading as regular folk at the fair, they are taken by these girls, and they proceed to hire them. Lady Harriet gives her name as Martha. Okay, and the girls are soon dismayed to find they are legally bound to their new masters for a year. Okay, so this festival thing has kind of got out of hand, that if you go down there for fun and you get bound over to somebody, you have to fulfill this thing for a year, probably until the next festival. And then Sir Tristan finds out about this, and he tries to get them out of the contract, and that doesn't work, so they're stuck working for these guys. Now, Act 2, both farmers fall for their new maidservants. Lionel falls for Harriet, and Harriet is really Martha, and Plunkett falls for Nancy. It turns out they're not so great at housework, probably because they have not done it before, being these upper crust ladies. And the guys kind of get upset that they're no good at it. And at night, the guys are upset, and the ladies are upset. Everybody gets upset, and then nighttime comes, they go to bed, and at night, the girls sneak out the window, and they escape. Okay, so Act 3, and this is sometime later, Lionel, keep that name in mind, is wandering in the forest, and he comes across this hunting party. And he recognizes Lady Harriet as somebody he knows, all right? Lady Harriet, Martha, that's the one he hired. And he declares his love for her. He says, oh, I've been searching for you, and now I found you. And he declares his love for her, and etc. And she blows him off. She wants nothing to do with the guy, right? And Tristan says, take this guy away and have him in prison. Now, before he's hauled off, he pulls off his ring, and he gives it to Lady Harriet, and he says, my father gave me this, and he said, if I ever get in trouble, this ring needs to go to the queen, and she'll know what to do. So she takes the ring, and they get it to the queen. Well, it turns out that Lionel, and you can probably figure this out, Lionel is really this nobleman. He got kind of rooked out of his inheritance. He never knew he was a nobleman, and he really is a noble, rich guy. The queen restores his inheritance. Lady Harriet, Martha, falls for the guy, and they live happily ever after. It's a comic opera with a happy ending. Okay, now let's think about this a little bit. We have Bloom, who is this usurped guy who's wandering out there in Dublin. And we have Molly, who is having this assignation. And she's not thinking really about Bloom. She's thinking about Boylan herself and having her needs met. We will see later in the book how things work themselves somewhat out. I don't want to give that away right now. But you can see how this opera fits in. Now, Joyce was a huge opera fan. And so this opera, Martha, is very central to this episode. And there are a couple of key pieces. There's the Last Rose of Spring, which is an Irish folk song, which is part of that opera. And there is another big piece in the opera that Bloom hears when he first comes in, and he knows it's from the opera Martha, and he even thinks that's a coincidence because he was just thinking about Martha, and then now they're singing this song from the opera Martha. So you might have noticed that at the beginning and wonder what he's talking about. What coincidence is that? So that's the summary of the opera. Now I have a surprise for you at the end of this video, so stay tuned. Now, Bloom starts to write his Martha response letter. Now, he's started this process before, and he's given thought. Remember, he was going to meet up with her, and then he decided against it. Now he's going to respond. And Richie Goulding, they're having dinner, and Richie Goulding's looking, oh, what are you doing? Responding to an ad because he's got the paper. Bloom is covering up what he's trying to write with the newspaper, and Richie says, oh, you're responding to an ad, and Bloom's, yeah. And he covers it up, and he starts to get this letter written. And the tension is building. We hear this singing in the background, and we hear this tap, 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 tap. Makes you want to scream this, and it's coming closer. Tap, 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 tap. Now, the big pieces of music in this episode are the music from the opera Martha and the Crappie Boy. Now, the Crappie Boy is an Irish ballad. It has a lot of meaning to the Irish people, and I'm going to have a surprise for you there too, because I'd like you to hear these pieces, and I'm making a special thing for you. Okay, but the Crappie Boy is a very sentimental piece about this boy that he's going to go fight the British, and before he enlists, he needs to make his last confession. So he goes to the priest, and he asks if the priest is there, and then a British soldier is there, and he puts a coat on, and he is an imposter of a priest. He usurps the church in the role of a priest. He hears the boy's confession, and the boy says, well, I'm going off to kill and fight the British. And then the British guy orders him arrested, and he's hung in the street right then and there. So it's a ballad of, you know, the cruelty of the British and Irish martyrdom. Has a lot of deep meaning to the Irish people, and I'd like you to hear it. So that's coming. It's a very, very important piece, and it's very central to this. Now, I said earlier that the girls aren't the sirens, and they're not. The sirens, that thing which will pull us to the rocks and crash us, it's not the girls, it's not women, it's sentimentality. Sentimentality is what is crashing these people. We hear them sing the song from the opera Martha, and they all get melancholy and boo-hoo. And they do the crappie boy song, and everybody gets sentimental. And Bloom hears this. Remember, Odysseus tied himself to the mast and didn't put the wax in his ear. Bloom hears this stuff, and at first he's overcome with grief. And at the end he says he's so lonely. He just feels so alone and so lonely that the sentimentality is ripping him apart. But he doesn't succumb to it. The rest of them are crashing on the rocks, not of the women. They're crashing on the rocks of sentimentality. Now, go back to what I said in previous episodes about the Irish literary revival. They want to bring back the old language, bring back the old traditions, bring back the old mythology. And what does Joyce say about that? No, don't look back, look forward. Make new things. Make a new Irish culture. Make a new Irish mentality. Make a new Irish mythology. Make new Irish writing. Make a new Ireland. Don't look back to the old stuff. And so he wants us to resist that sentimentality. Not that music can't, you know, give us that feeling of melancholy, or that it's wrong to experience music at your soul and at its core and your core. He's not saying that's no good. He's saying don't fall to sentimentality. Don't let that be it. Okay? So at the end, we see Bloom steps out, and he starts to walk down the street, and he's feeling just overwhelmed, lonely, sad. These feelings from this music has evoked. And he sees a prostitute that he knows. I think he made an appointment with her once that he didn't keep, too close to home. He says, probably just didn't go through with it, because Joyce likes to look and talk but not act, you know, so probably another Bloom thing. But she comes forward, and she's trying to get him, and he resists that siren. He arrives at an antique shop, and he looks in the window, and there is a picture painting of the crappie boy, and he reads the final words of the crappie boy, you know, and the last words of his country, and you can read that in the episode. More sentimentality. But then Bloom doesn't go for it. He doesn't fall for the sentimentality. And one of the things that he thinks about is, you know, why didn't that guy recognize that it wasn't a priest that was taking the confession? Why didn't he see through that? You know, Joyce sees these, Bloom sees these things, and he resists that sentimentality. And he starts, the gas is building up in him, and he thinks about the culture of passing gas, and that some cultures it's okay, some it's bad. You know, I shouldn't do that at a banquet, he says, but out here on the street, what's it matter? And the episode ends with Bloom passes gas, and that's the end. So rather than this musical crescendo for the end of this episode, it ends with wonderful. Now, a couple of thoughts I want to leave you with. One is Bloom is a changed man. He is a different guy. He is stronger. We see that because rather than flee from Boylan, he goes into the Ormond to observe Boylan. Granted, he doesn't confront him, but he's not fearing him. He has remorse and sadness, and he feels very lonely. But fear is no longer a part of that. When he thinks of the sentimentality, it's dismissed in that gas. Okay? So while the rest of Dublin is falling for the sentimentality, Joyce Bloom passes gas and moves on. It's interesting stuff. Now, you've got to experience this music. Okay? So here's what I'm going to do. I have permission to use songs that are mentioned and sung in this episode. And I'm going to make a special video and provide you with the link so you can go hear this music and experience it for yourself. It's sort of a little bonus. And I'm going to hide it so you get to go off and find it and experience the music and hear it firsthand. Now, I highly recommend that you go listen to this music and see how it feels. It's very important. That will give you a sense of this whole episode. Okay, so I'll put the link at the very end of the video. I'm not going to say it, but I'll put the link there so you can see it. Okay, so do that. It's not a promotion. I'm not trying to get you to go click or anything. I just want to put it somewhere else so it's fun. Now, one other thing. We have part of our musical tension as we hear the jangle of Boylan's cart, his car, as he heads toward the Bloom residence. It's jangling down the streets, and he arrives at the Bloom residence, and we see, this is near the end, it's about 5 pages before the end of the chapter, we see Molly, there's a knock at the door, and she looks in the mirror, last look, right? And then she opens the door and she looks out both ways to see if anybody sees him, and he's in. Okay, so we know Bloom has arrived. We know he's in. The hour has come. I hope you enjoyed that. I love your comments. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If it helped you, I'd love to hear from you. Your comments mean a lot to me. I'd love to hear them. After this, there will be a link. It's going to pop up and tell you where to go find the mystery video so you can hear the music of this episode. Thanks. I'll see you next time.